Well, friends, today we find ourselves listening to a prophetic message and have a rare glimpse into God's inner thoughts. This image that we find is dangerously and wondrously human, as God is literally clearing away and sorting out a landscape of varied emotions. It is as if, for an instance, God doesn't fully know God's self. This state of having a conflicted heart, like I said earlier, this should be all too familiar to us. It turns out we're not always the best at reading our own emotions or those of others, and perhaps making good choices thereafter. Our emotional naivete or sheer avoidance has spawned a lot of good one-liners, so I have to share a few of those right now. What's the definition of mixed emotions? When you see your mother-in-law backing off a cliff in your brand new car. My mother-in-law is listening to this, so sorry, Anne. My ex told me we broke up because I am too reliant on logic and refuse to acknowledge my emotions. I told her that correlation does not equal causation. There's a stereotype that Scottish men are bad at showing their emotions. Well, this isn't true. I once knew a Scot who loved his wife so much he almost told her. My psychologist says I'm having trouble identifying my emotions, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. And lastly, for those of us who require a little less sophistication, what part of the leg understands your emotions? The empathize. Ouch. Ouch. I had to put that one in there. So interestingly, there was a scientific study about jokes, and it was found that jokes that are too complex, jokes containing too many emotional states within their characters, were found to be less funny or not funny at all. It was concluded the job of a good comic is to make sure the audience isn't left feeling as though they missed the punchline. This can happen with complex humor because we have an innate natural ability to only handle a limited number of mind states. So this reminds me of one of the most helpful principles I've learned in my working life through a savvy and wise church manager here. It's called the KISS principle. You guys heard of the KISS principle? Keep it simple, stupid, right? I found after I started applying the KISS principle, my life really got a lot better and my work started showing it. But a prophetic truth is that, friends, love is complicated. And possessing a heart faithful to God, a perfected love, this is a tough business. Naturally, innately, we can only handle a limited, simplified version of God's love, or any love for that matter. And perhaps these last few years have caused you to wonder greatly at the world around you. And I'm specifically talking about national events, and even more particularly, the rise of white nationalism in our country, like the Charlottesville rally in 2017 that turned into a riot. Among other things, a counter-protester was run over and killed by one of the self-proclaimed white nationalists. Images of this incident perhaps haunt you like they haunt me, and they leave me uneasy about our nation. When I joined in the March for Our Lives, a high school student-led demonstration through downtown Appleton, protesting gun violence, I was met with both smiles and words of encouragement and thumbs up, and grown adults calling us communists and stupid snowflakes for protesting together. It just seems so bizarre, right? And confusing and just incongruous how people treat one another so differently. Once again, I was left concerned about our nation, uneasy about this idea of nationalism, questioning my own sense of patriotism. What does it mean to love one's country when it can be so hateful and so violent? What does it mean to love one's country knowing it was founded on the displacement of a native peoples? What does love of country mean on Veterans Day weekend when we honor those who have devoted their service to our nation's protection and liberty? So you can see why the headline in the Atlantic reading, "Nationalism is a form of love, not hate," quickly caught my attention. The author quotes a great Italian nationalist, the 19th century writer and activist who agitated for the unification of Italy, saying this. He said, "Our country is our home, the home which God has given us, placing therein a numerous family which we love and are loved by, and with which we have a more intimate and quicker communion of feeling and thoughts than with others." This sentiment underlies how loyalty of nation is ultimately built on a foundation of love. Love for a nation's landscape, love for a nation's arts, love for its traditions, and love for its people. In short, things that are ours and that we share in common. Further, he argues that nationalism is also the foundation of a democratic political order. And he says that anyone who believes otherwise, or that this could easily be repressed and a broader-minded loyalty replacing it, he says they are profoundly mistaken. Now, I have no glib answers or one-liners about love for country. But I can tell you that in these past few years, I have engaged in the same lament that God engages here in Hosea for Israel. But my lament was with my country, the United States. It is a conflicted heart with which I talk about today. And I can think of no greater example of a conflicted heart towards one's country than my grandfather. He was drafted into World War II in the Marines as a medic, and eventually was part of the final waves that stormed the beaches of Okinawa. He could often be found in the evening in his home in Champaign, reliving his call of duty by watching Victory at Sea blaring on the living room television. And this Catholic always had a Marine sticker on his car saying, "To err is human, to love is divine. Neither is the policy of the U.S. Marine Corps." He told me stories of traveling the seas and the many things that he saw. And as I became older and started to ask questions, he told me even more. The last few years he was alive, he told me things that, well, they were terrible. Stories that blurred the line between right and wrong and showed the desperation and bleakness of war itself. And in telling these stories, you could see in his face a mix of honor and pride and dishonor and shame and bravery and disgrace. I deeply respected my grandfather for enduring something that was so horrific and not being completely destroyed by it the rest of his life. Perhaps his conflicted heart is representative of our many veterans who have lived through something similar. One author shares, sometimes I think the human heart is just a simple shelf, right? There's only so much you can pile onto it before something falls off the edge and you're left to pick up the pieces. The human heart and its love is complex. Our love of country, our love of one another, our love of self and God, these things are mysterious and they are holy. And sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. And there's a lot of times where we are just left confused and wondering. And that's why this picture in Hosea, this parental picture of God having to work things out, a portrait of God's own conflicted heart, is much like my puzzling experience of parenting, perhaps yours. Just like God bending down to pick up Israel, I think of all the times I have bent down to pick up my children and the dizzying feelings and emotions that swirl around those memories. There's the bending down and picking up of Madison and Elijah after a week apart, and they rush into my arms in love and we hug tightly. There's the bending down and the picking up of my children to hold them in their pain when they have fallen and their swollen lips need a boo-boo pack. There's the bending down and picking up of my children at Woodman's or at Target, where they are screaming and arching their backs because they did not get the toy they wanted. All these acts of bending down and picking up bring forth such competing and confusing and different feelings. And yet Hosea says God's love for Israel, for us, is so much like this image. God is the one that bends down and lifts up. God is the one that lifts us up, God's beloved children. So one theologian pointed out that in order for this image of God, right, the bending down and picking up, in order for this to be authentic, there are some theological implications, ways of understanding the nature of God that we have to address in order for this image to exist. First, there is the Calvinistic idea of accommodation. That is, that God is willing to make certain accommodations in order to communicate with us in a capacity that we might understand. And then second, there is the reconciling nature of God, who is willing to come to us in the Word made flesh. In the beginning of the Gospel of John, Karl Barth writes that this act itself is an act of condescension or humiliation of God's infinite self, just to be with us, to be next to us in this bending down, to meet us where we are, and to truly be God with us. And lastly, there is this Jewish Kabbalistic notion of Zinzim. And I find this to be the most compelling image of all, which is the belief that in the creation process, God actually has to make space out of nothing, make room for another person, another people to exist. God is making room for us out of nothing, creating this void within God's self for us to be and become. God bends down and lifts us up so that we might understand, so that we might be reconciled, so that we would have the room to be and to exist surrounded by the loving arms of God. Now, some might find this humanization of God disturbing and argue that there is nothing in God's heart but a pure love, a singular emotional expression that can best be seen through his Son, Jesus, who was the ultimate expression and perfection of this one-dimensional love. Some might want to explain this imagery in Hosea away as merely a prophetic metaphor that talks about something else, for it is dangerous to think that God might ever have to wrestle with God's own self, that God's heart might be akin to ours. But who here, who among us can honestly say you've never been conflicted in heart, confused by others, misunderstanding of the multifaceted and mysterious reality of the power of love? Who here has utter clarity in all aspects of their loving relationships with others? No one. None of us can make that kind of claim. So that is why this soliloquy, this divine sorting and wrestling with anger and joy and disappointment and compassion, is perhaps one of the most hopeful and freeing depictions of the human heart that we might ever have. God knows what it is like to be turned away from, to be disowned by those whom we relentlessly and tirelessly provide for and nurture. God knows what it is like to have one's heart recoil inside oneself in pain. God knows. God knows. And God shows that when we are in a place that is confusing and complex, and we are lost and fumbling around to find a way forward, weighed heavy, God shows we are walking on holy ground. We are in a holy place, a place marked by the divine work and the divine heart of God. We are in a sacred practice in that moment, engaging in sacred, blessed work. What is the work of God? Perhaps one day, as we strive to show love, despite our innately limited hearts, our shelves overflowing and needing to be picked up, we'll remember how God concluded in Hosea. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. So come to me. Do not stop, for it is to you the things of the kingdom of heaven belong. Thanks be for the mysterious, holy, and wonderful human heart. Thanks be for the mysterious, holy, divine heart of God. Amen.